Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Brandy. I'm with Act for Alexandria, and welcome back to our second session of Leading and Living Well in Anxious Times. We are excited to have Heather Jelks joining us again. And today she's going to be talking about cultivating a calm and centered practice. So I think that's something that we all could use a little bit of. So welcome. We are going to encourage you to use the chat. Heather will prompt us at different points to put in some of our thoughts, feelings, experiences that we've been having. So we really encourage you to use that, as well as time for Q&A. We'll have someone monitoring the chat. We have Molly and Leanne from the Act for Alexandria team. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And this is being recorded, so you'll have a chance to view this afterwards. And we'll go ahead and get started. Heather, welcome.
Good morning, Brandy. Thank you so much for hosting me. Welcome back, everybody, and thank you, Molly and Leanne, for holding the space this morning. I hope you all had a wonderful 3-day weekend. I know it can be a little discombobulating to start fresh on Tuesday morning after a little extended time off. So I welcome you back. You might want to take a centering breath, and we're going to focus this morning on, again, a second part in a series, Living and Leading in Anxious Times. Our focus today is on cultivating a calm and centered presence, which actually might be a great way to start off this shorter week. You might remember that last week when we were together kicking off this series for nonprofit leaders in Alexandria City, we focused on reactivity. Recognizing and working well with reactivity in ourselves and in others. And we know in highly anxious times, we are all more predisposed to behave reactively. You might remember we described reactivity as the public face of anxiety. So, cultivating a calm and centered presence. Why that matters? Well, we'd all like to avoid, as this cartoon depicts, the scream room. And I also want to suggest to you that as a leader for your organization, cultivating a calm and centered presence, building on what we recognize as reactivity from our conversation last week, it really matters for you as a leader. When you are cultivating actively a calm and centered presence, you really serve as a step-down transformer for the anxiety in the system around you, whether that's your workplace system, even virtually, or whether that's your family system. And I think step-down transformer is a really apt metaphor. If you're not familiar with what a step-down transformer is, it's actually a piece of equipment that transforms high voltage, low power electrical current to low voltage, high power. And it works just the same. When you are working on your own quality of presence as a leader, you really do serve as a step-down transformer for the anxiety around you. I want to suggest that this might be an apt time to really focus on what are those key qualities of presence that really serve you as a leader. I think I might have mentioned to you last week when we met that I'm recently begun working with a CEO in a senior residency or resident community right in the epicenter of this pandemic. And she's really reaching out for coaching at this particular time because she wants to work on her quality of presence. She really wants to work on how she shows up so that she can be that step-down transformer, both for her leadership team as well as for the seniors who live in that community. So I would ask you to consider these questions right now. In a time of crisis, who do you follow? What are the qualities you desire most in a leader? Right now, I'd appreciate it if you would reflect on those questions and capture your responses in the chat room or the chat box. So take a few moments to reflect on, during a time of crisis, who are you inclined to follow? What are those qualities or attributes that are most desirable in a leader, particularly during a time of crisis? So please go ahead and document your thoughts in the chat box. Thank you. Are we seeing anything yet, Molly, in the chat?
Sure, we just got a couple of answers. One is compassion. Another person said calm, measured, compassionate leaders, those who will stand tall but remain human and personable. In times of crisis, I appreciate leaders who I see as trustworthy, so sincere, calm, and competent. And then someone else said grace and wisdom under fire and humility.
Lovely. Thank you. Well, I have some thoughts too that really do piggyback on what you've captured in the chat based on your own experience, those qualities that are really essential for a leader to cultivate, particularly during a time of crisis. I want to share with you, though, why it matters to be actively cultivating these qualities of presence, particularly during a time of crisis. As it turns out, based on the research, leaders are just as susceptible to emotional contagion. Pictured here is a Professor Sigal Barsad from Yale University, and she's done quite a lot of research and presented on the topic of mood management and emotional climate. And what she says here is one of the things we also know is that negative emotions, particularly fear and anxiety, they cause us to become very rigid in our own decision making. We're not creative. We talked about that last week, how our prefrontal cortex tends to go offline when we're hijacked by anxiety. So even we as leaders are not as analytical. We can actually make worse decisions. She writes here, emotional contagion affects everyone, which means that it can also affect you as a leader. And I would offer as well the perspective that your emotional mood, the emotions that you are most embodying to those around you, are the ones that are most contagious by virtue of your position of authority. So it really does matter what particular emotion you are embodying and how you're telegraphing that to others around you. This is why it matters so much that you actively seek to cultivate a calm and centered presence. As you pointed out in the chat, that's precisely one of the key attributes that you described as essential for a leader, particularly one who's leading during a time of crisis. So I want to share with you what I would view as the 4 essential qualities, many of which you already captured. So this will be a reiteration of what you already described in the chat. Based on my experience in working with leaders in a variety of different environments and at a variety of different challenging times, I really view these to be the 4 essential qualities for leaders to actively seek to embody, to cultivate during a time of crisis. And the first one you captured as well in the chat, calm, right? As I mentioned a moment ago, when you are more calm than everyone else around you, you do serve as that step-down transformer for the anxiety others are experiencing. One could say that your nervous system, it's a resource for every other nervous system around you. And because you're in that position of authority, even in this virtual environment, people are looking to you to set the tone, to create the emotional climate around them. So your ability to be calm, even if it's just slightly more calm than everybody else, has a powerful and potent impact on those around you. You also mentioned, I think in the chat, someone who is clear, right? Our capacity to lead with clarity really matters now more than ever. We talked about the fact that we're functioning now in a VUCA environment. Last week we mentioned that, and you might remember the U of VUCA is for uncertainty. Times are extremely uncertain right now, and we crave stability during uncertain times. We look toward leaders to provide clarity. So you in your leadership role need to be actively seeking any kind of opening to demonstrate to your team what matters most, what are your key priorities as an organization, what's going to change, what's not going to change, what are the questions that are central to how you and your organization function right now. Any actions you can take, any conversations you can have to provide clarity are all the more essential now during a time of such overwhelming uncertainty. The third quality I want to mention here is conviction. And what I mean by conviction is your ability to take a clear stand, even when it may be unpopular, even when there may be some pushback. Because what we know by virtue of how anxiety travels is when a leader is able to be calm, to lead with clarity, and to be able to take a clear stand and lead with conviction, even in uncertain times, it serves to tamp down the anxiety in the people around them. And the fourth quality that I think several of you mentioned in the chat was compassion. Right? We are inclined to follow people, particularly during uncertain times, during a time of crisis, who we sense care sincerely about our interests, are able to sense into the suffering of others, and seek actively to alleviate that suffering. So you might ask yourself, actually, let me go back here because I want to encourage you to reflect on these four qualities in the next couple of moments and identify for yourself, which of these do you believe is a source of strength for you? In other words, you've gotten feedback during your years of leading others that this is a real area of strength for you. Is it your capacity for calm or to lead with clarity? Maybe it's your ability to take a clear stand when needed. Or perhaps you're really known for your quality of compassion. So identify which one is an area of strength for you. I would also invite you to consider which of these needs to be strengthened. Which of these muscles isn't as strong as the others? And to identify that for yourself. It's helpful to have both an awareness, an increased awareness of both our strength and what is that muscle we want to be actively exercising and strengthening through practice. So this next slide suggests that we want to be seeking out strategies for cultivating these 4 C's. Our ability to be calm, to lead with clarity and conviction and compassion. How do we do that? And I would suggest to you that when we start to pay more conscious attention to our habits, then we are better able to discern what is it that we're currently practicing that is serving us in the way of cultivating those 4 C's. And are there some habits we're in that are subtly undermining our capacity to be calm, to lead with clarity and conviction and compassion? One of the areas of habit I'd like to point us toward is a habit of mood. As we mentioned a few moments ago, by virtue of your position of authority, your emotional state is contagious, positive or negative. It sets the tone for the emotional climate around you in your organization and also addresses anxiety in those whom you're leading. So I would offer that when you're consciously paying attention to your mood, you have a much better ability to actively cultivate these 4 C's. When I was studying with a really masterful coach some years ago, one of the statements that he shared with me as a coach in training was really powerful and has remained with me. We are what we have been practicing, and we become what we intentionally practice. So I would suggest to you the area of mood is a really important area for you to be actively paying attention to in order to better cultivate a mood that's resourceful, that supports your embodiment of those 4 C's. And I want to make a distinction here between emotion and mood. We could say that emotion, as I pointed out last week, is a physiological response to a perceived opportunity or threat, internal or external. And scientists say it has a duration of about 1 to 2 minutes. A mood, however, is more persistent. It prevails over time because we have an emotional experience, it's felt in the body, and then we might reinforce that emotion with a particular thought or narrative. So over time, that emotion becomes a more predominant mood. And you may know people whom you've come into contact with who are in a mood for almost an entire lifetime. I want to suggest to you that your mood really matters as a leader, and that there are moods that are more generative and more resourceful, and there are moods that are less so. So I've borrowed from a mood chart from Alan Seiler, who's beloved in the coaching community for his research and publications related to mood management. And you might note here that there are some moods depicted here, and this is not an exhaustive chart by any means, but it does capture what are the recognized predominant moods that we can easily slip into that are just below our conscious awareness. And as I said a moment ago, some of these are going to strike you as much more generative and resourceful. They're going to support cultivating a more positive emotional climate around you, and others less so. For instance, a mood of resignation would be not nearly as impactful in terms of cultivating a positive emotional climate around you than would be a mood of curiosity or wonder, possibility. You might take a look at this variety of moods depicted here and identify, as you consider the last 7, 8, 9 weeks that we've been a part of this event unfolding around us, what has been your predominant mood? Has it been a mood that's been more generally resourceful, generative, or perhaps not so much? And as you look ahead, in terms of the quality of impact that you want to have on those around you and on the future of your organization, which of these moods would be most beneficial for you to be actively cultivating? Give that some thought, if you would, for the next moment. So you might be considering the question as you look toward actively cultivating a more resourceful and generative mood for the sake of embodying those qualities of calm and clarity, conviction and compassion. In essence, being a step-down transformer for the anxiety in the system around you. I would suggest that the pathway toward making that all possible is to train the mind and to train the body, that both are essential. We become, as I mentioned earlier, we become what we intentionally practice. And we're always practicing something, usually not so consciously. When we are actively training the mind and training the body, I want to suggest to you that gives us access to a space. I love this particular statement here. It's attributed to the writings of Viktor Frankl. And if you're not familiar with Viktor Frankl, he survived a concentration camp experience during the Holocaust, wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning. And his writings suggest that between stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space lies our power to choose. And in our response lies our growth and freedom. So he's suggesting that we do have an opportunity to more actively choose our response when we're building in some space between stimulus and response. And I want to suggest to you that that space is made more available to us when we are training our mind as well as our body. Both are essential pathways toward accessing that space. The first strategy I want to offer you for training our mind is a long, it's been around, I want to say, for a long time. 30 years ago, this is probably well before some of you may have even been born. 30 years ago, a book was published called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. And while much of the material is somewhat dated and not sort of aligned with how we tend to view things today in our more modern world, there is one suggested framework that I find to be incredibly powerful and potent. And I've been sharing with a lot of clients currently who are looking to access that space between stimulus and response, to actively strengthen their ability to be a choice around how they respond to this highly anxiety-provoking environment. What Covey suggests, and you might be familiar with the circle model, is that there are two different approaches to how we actually manage our time, our attention, and our energy. And he would suggest that a reactive approach looks like this. When someone is caught up in anxiety and caught up in reactivity, predominantly their energy and attention, their time, goes toward those things that are in their circle of concern. And Covey argued that this circle of concern is largely filled with things we can do very little about personally, which in essence means that the area that we can most accurately control, in fact, our own behavior, we lose sight of because we become overly fixated on that which we cannot truly control or, as he suggested, even influence. So as you'll note here in the framework or the model, the circle of concern is larger than both our circles of control and influence. However, he did offer an alternative approach, and I would suggest that's what's really helpful here in terms of training our mind, where our energy and attention go. He suggested a proactive approach. So when we're less run by our anxiety and actively seeking to be a choice about how we respond, we tend to have a proactive approach. And what that looks like is this. We focus in on our own behavior first. We look at our own functioning first. How am I responding? Additionally, we look at what we can actually influence. What can I actually influence here? I know for some organizations I've been connected with, they're looking at different scenarios around, for instance, their budget. They're looking toward what funding will be available or potentially not available to them, and then creating different scenarios in order to respond to those possibilities more thoughtfully. I would suggest that that's really focusing in on your circle of influence. And what Covey proposed is that when we do that intentionally, our circle of concern actually shrinks. We can be seeking out what's in our circle of concern that we can actually do something about actively, move that into our circle of influence, and as a result, we start to shrink our circle of concern. So that's training the mind. Second strategy I want to highlight here is training the body. And some of you may already be familiar with the work of Dr. Amy Cuddy. She teaches in Harvard's Business School, a social scientist, wrote a book called Leadership Presence, and her original TED Talk went viral early, lots of views. And what she's really researching in her lab and in her experiments is the connection between comportment, mood, actions that we take, and then of course the results that we get from those actions. What she suggested through her research is that our bodies change our minds, and our minds can change our behavior, and our behavior can actually inform our outcomes. And this runs a little contrary to how we typically think about our behavior, but what's standardly true is that, or appears to be true from the research, is that dependent upon our actual comportment or shape, that evokes and reinforces a particular mood. And of course, we could all probably agree that we largely take actions out of our mood. And our mood is not something we're entirely conscious of much of the time. Those actions then produce certain results. In other words, how we sit, how we stand, actually affects what we think, how we feel, and what we do. So with that research in mind, I want to suggest to you a practice for training your body. When I'm working with clients, I'll often guide them at the beginning of a coaching session through a much more involved centering practice. For our purposes today, I want to offer this abbreviated version. I call it 6-second centering. And it's a practice to actively cultivate the shape that supports a more generative, resourceful mood that's going to enable you to plant the seeds for those qualities of leadership that we identified are so vital during this time of crisis: calm and clarity, conviction and compassion. So in this practice, the first 2 seconds are designed to support you feeling your breath, focusing in on your breath. The second 2 seconds, feel your feet. Actively feel your feet. Sense into that connection between your feet, or the soles of your feet, and the floor or the ground. The final 2 seconds are instructing us to feel our spine. When we start to sense into our spine, you can't help but sit slightly taller, a little bit more in your dignity. And then I want to suggest is that when we practice, we spend the next moment noticing the impact. Has there been a shift internally by virtue of making an external shift to our comportment, our physical shape? So I would encourage you to do this practice right now. If you're game, to take a moment, the first 2 moments or first 2 seconds, to feel your breath. The second 2 seconds, feel your feet. These last 2 seconds, feel your spine. And notice the impact of that. Oftentimes, if we give ourselves this pause and center physically, even in just 6 short seconds, we can start to experience an internal shift. And that's largely due to the direct connection between our comportment and our internal mood. So, quick recap here. We're suggesting that emotions and moods are contagious, and yours as a leader are more contagious than anybody else's by virtue of your position of authority. That when we are aware of the impact of our mood, that you as a leader are setting the climate emotionally in the environment around you, then you're probably going to be more inclined to actively be seeking out strategies for cultivating these key leadership qualities of presence, particularly during this anxious time. Quality of calm, your ability to lead with clarity and conviction, as well as compassion. And I want to suggest that there are 2 key strategies that you could be weaving into, integrating into your routine as a leader that wouldn't add to your to-do list, but would be about actively training your mind and your body to embody a more resourceful and generative mood and plant the seeds for those 4 C's. And that is to focus in on your circles of control and influence and to practice 6-second centering. So, a couple of ideas for some homework, some way of helping these concepts and practices to have some stickiness for you. I'd suggest that you take a few minutes today to identify what's in your circles of control and influence. And what, if anything, can you do to shift something from your circle of concern into your circle of influence? I'd suggest that you make a pact with yourself, that you practice 6-second centering 3 times a day. I have some clients who do this. They set a timer for themselves on their alarm that pings them and helps remind them, because this is the part that's tricky, right? Is remembering to do these things. So practice 3 6-second centering a day. And I would also encourage you to reflect back on that quality that you felt may be one that you want to be actively strengthening out of the 4 C's, and to identify what are some strategies you could be actively practicing to cultivate that particular C. Just to remember that that's a quality that you want to be actively strengthening for the sake of your team and for your organization. And finally, a couple of resources that I would point you toward that might be helpful to you during this time. The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. If you haven't read it or if it's not on your bookshelf, it's always a helpful one to remind us of some strategies available to us to really lead proactively versus reactively. Leadership Embodiment, How We Sit and Stand Can Change the Way We Think and Speak. This is by Wendy Palmer, who I've trained with some, and she partners with a neuroscientist when she wrote this book. And it's got some great strategies for how to practice listening, centered listening, through the way we actually shape ourselves and face into our conversations with others. And I do have some guided practices on my website. I would also suggest, if you haven't read Amy Cuddy's book, Presence, Bring Your Boldest Self to Your Biggest Challenges, that's also a really terrific resource that brings us into greater awareness around the impact of our comportment and strategies for actively cultivating a comportment that's in service of the kind of impact that you want to have. So thank you so much for joining us this morning after a 3-day weekend. I hope this has resourced you in some positive way. And I'm happy to stay on the line if you all want to exchange some best practices or some Q&A. I'll stop sharing my screen now. Now I can see everyone, yay. So I'm wondering if there are any questions or any practices that you all are consistently in that really support your being a calm and centered presence for your team.
I have a question. I really like the 6-second strategy. I'm curious to understand, if you're willing to share a little bit, what like a slightly less abbreviated version would look like. I'm curious what's in between that and like 20-minute mindfulness meditation sessions.
Yeah. Oh, I really encourage you. Is it Rose? I have to put my glasses on. Hey,
no,
Rose. I'm gonna put my glasses on. Yeah, so I have some lengthier versions of guided centering practices that are on my website, and I welcome you to take a look at the resources page. I did some studying with a fellow named Richard Strozzi Heckler, who trained me as a somatic coach. And with a deep background in Aikido and body work, his philosophy is that many of our habits live in our muscle tissue. The issues are in the tissue, so to speak. And so the version of centering that I was introduced to is longer version, and it helps align our physical body in 3 dimensions that it exists in: length and width and depth. And I start off every coaching session with a client with a version of centering, and a longer version is available on my website. And I would encourage you to listen to one of those and see what the impact is for you. And then you can make it your own.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Oh, you're welcome.
There's a comment here that says, I begin my day with meditation and prayer to help me stay grounded and to prepare my heart and mind for the day ahead.
Lovely. Yeah. Many of the clients I'm working with, and this may be true for you, find that the time that they practice in the morning really sets the tone for the rest of their day. And part of that practice is also nailing down for themselves, what is their intention for the day? There's a wonderful book out there called How to Have a Good Day. I'm not remembering the author's name right now. It's based on the science, though, associated with, the neuroscience around a variety of different practices that can resource us effectively, regardless of what position we hold in an organization. One of the practices that this person writes about, based on her own experience and based on the science, is called aim, attitude, attention. And I love that practice. It's easy to remember 3 A's. Aim meaning once you've had that time of reflection in the morning, you decide what your aim is for the day. Is there a particular outcome that you want to be mobilizing yourself around? Attention is then, what do I need to give my attention to during the course of the day that is in support of that aim? And then finally, what does my attitude need to be? What do I need to actively cultivate in support of that aim or desired outcome for the day? So I love what you wrote in the chat about that practice of prayer and mindfulness. And I offered this additional strategy to really help us home in on intention for the day. And I often think that that's really helpful to keep in mind so that we are more likely to fulfill on our intentions if we declare them to ourselves, right? If we're intentional about our intentions. Any other practices that you all are in that really support being a calm and centered presence? Are we getting anything in the chat, Molly?
I don't see any comments except for there are a lot of thank yous and these were really great and specific strategies and very helpful.
Oh, good, good.
Oh, another comment was nature walks. Nature walks help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Well, if there isn't anything else that you all want to share or ask about, I want to thank you so much for, especially after a long weekend, making yourself available for this session. I hope it supported you and that you're continuing to take good care of yourself as you're doing this really important work in our community. Thank you so much for everything you're doing.
Thank you, Heather. And we're going to be back next week at 9:30. We'll send you all a copy of the recording as soon as we have it ready. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Have a great day, everyone.